Welcome back to Unknown Military History, discussing the Polish-Soviet War. The last episode, we discussed the origins and background of what would lead to this important theater of conflict. Now, we will discuss the beginnings of the Polish-Soviet War and the early stages of this conflict. In 1919, as the Bolshevik forces were fighting on all fronts against the White Russians in Siberia and the Crimea, as well as independence movements in the West, Vladimir Lenin would issue orders to the Red Army under the code name Target Vistula. In order to subdue the chaos that had collapsed Russia and Eastern Europe in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution and the end of World War I, Lenin's strategic goal was to march his forces through Eastern and Central Europe in order to subdue the newly independent nations such as Poland, and then support communist movements that had sprung up in nations such as in Germany and Austria. Lenin would order the formation of the Western Army. While the Bolsheviks did not consider these newly established states to put up much resistance against the Red Army, the ongoing Russian Civil War complicated things militarily and logistically. Starting on January 12th, the Soviet High Command declared the goal of Target Vistula to the Nieman River in central Belarus, but a month later that goal was to the Bug River in Poland. Fighting began to break out by accident without any orders from either side beginning in 1919. Polish military units under General Władysław, residing in borderland areas of Lithuania, Belarus, and western Ukraine, which had been subdued by the Bolsheviks, began clashing with local communist forces and Bolshevik groups. However, the Polish border units had to withdraw due to news of a larger Soviet arrival in the region. On January 5th, the Red Army had entered Minsk, the capital of the Belarusian People's Republic, unopposed. The fall of Minsk spelled the end for a short-lived Belarusian state. Despite the fall of Belarus to the Bolsheviks, Poles and Belarusians living in the region formed partisan groups under the aid of Pilsudski's regime in Poland. While these groups were small and often ill-equipped, they were determined to fight against the Bolsheviks and defend their homeland. Newspapers in Eastern Europe began springing up, urging locals to fight against the Red Menace. Meanwhile, the main Polish army began sending their units to assist these groups, while the Bolsheviks sent their own armies west. Though the Soviet army had over 2 million men deployed, the majority of these men, as well as their generals, were east fighting White Russian forces in Siberia and Central Asia. Meanwhile, the Poles had over 500,000 men, and 230,000 of them on the Soviet front. The Polish government under Marshal Pilsudski negotiated a treaty with Germany to allow Polish units safe passage through territories in the east nominally under German control. A small number of Polish forces managed to secure the eastern border, while the southern sector, commanded by General Antoni Listowski, marched towards Brest and concentrated near the Antipol region. The northern section was protected by the Lithuanian Belarusian division under General Wacław. Around February 14th, the Polish units made contact with the first advance units of the Soviet Red Army. The front line began to stretch from Lithuania through Belarus to Ukraine. The initial events were lackluster, as Soviet units retreated without a fight from the town of Mosti, while fighting took place in multiple border towns in Belarus. These were mainly small skirmishes. The Bolshevik advance had come to a halt, and it soon became clear that the Red Army would not be able to break through the Polish lines with minimal attacks such as this. As said before, the Bolsheviks were fighting on all fronts and could not totally focus their forces on Poland. On the 27th of February 1919, the Bolsheviks proclaimed the creation of the Lithuanian Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. In the meantime, Poland and the Bolsheviks were also fighting in Ukraine, as well as in the Baltics. However, the main war itself had not reached Poland, as both forces were embroiled in conflicts in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks were busy fighting the Russian Civil War against anti-communist White Russians. In the early summer of 1919, the White Russians had managed to gain the upper hand. Forces under the command of Anton Denikin were marching on Moscow. However, despite this, Polish Marshal and leader Pilsudski halted the Polish offensives in Ukraine and the Baltics in order to allow the Bolsheviks an opportunity to push Denikin's Whites back. This was mainly because Denikin, who would also hold the title of Supreme Leader of Russia for a short period of time, had made clear that Poland was a splinter state that needed to be reincorporated into Russia once the Civil War ended, and that he wanted to assimilate Poland and its forces into Russia. Thus, Pilsudski saw the Whites as a greater threat, while the Bolsheviks seemed to have offered better peace terms. In early March of 1919, Polish units under General Stanislaw captured the cities of Slonim and launched an offensive across the Nieman River. Meanwhile, forces under Antoni Listowski took Pinsk and secured passages through the Jasiolda River. Marshal Joseph Pilsudski maintained that Polish forces must maintain the initiative on the Eastern Front, but avoid intervention in the ongoing Russian Civil War. An increasing number of Bolshevik and Polish forces began being brought to the border regions. In April, Bolshevik forces captured Grodno and Vilnius, but were pushed out after a successful Polish counteroffensive. Soviet orders for Target Vistula had largely failed, and it became clear that the Poles would not go down so easily. Despite this, however, Soviet forces for Target Vistula were never cancelled even amidst the Polish counteroffensive and stiff resistance. At the same time, the bulk of the Bolshevik forces were battling White Russians and their allies, and because of this, the Bolsheviks were forced to withdraw and reorganize their forces. Meanwhile, the Polish counteroffensive continued. General Lasowski recaptured the city of Lida, while General Mokrezi led a counteroffensive in which the major city of Vilnius was taken. By the 1st of July, Polish armies had advanced eastward, and by the 10th, they had recaptured Minsk. In August, an offensive towards the Daugava River was launched, and it succeeded by October. The minimal and unorganized Bolshevik forces were forced to retreat. By the time of 1920, the Polish offensive had been successful. While battles still raged against the Red Army, the Poles had stopped the Bolsheviks from delivering a knockout blow with Target Vistula. The Bolsheviks retreated from Latvia in the north to Ukraine in the south. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, Polish relations with the Lithuanians worsened. Polish politicians opposed the Lithuanian demands for complete independence and ceding the city of Vilnius. Thus, the Lithuanians began to lean more towards the Soviet side. Despite this, the Poles found allies in the Latvians. As for peace initiatives, there were quite a few which were brought up by both the Polish and the Soviet side. By late 1919, Polish diplomats under Marshal Pilsudski met with representatives from Lenin. Peace negotiations were unsuccessful. By this time, the tide had turned in favor of the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War, and the Soviets seemed ready to strike back at Poland. By this time, Marshal Pilsudski decided to set forth his plans for the Intermarium. The Intermarium was a geopolitical goal of uniting the nations of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth back in the 1700s, such as Poland, the Baltics, and Ukraine, into a single alliance. Thus, Marshal Pilsudski set his sights on Ukraine, which was embroiled in conflict at the time with both Russia and the Poles. In December of 1919, Pilsudski came to an agreement against his former rival, Simon Petliura, the exiled Ukrainian Supreme Commander. In this agreement, the Ukrainians declared their readiness to relinquish their claims in eastern Poland, while Poland agreed to recognize the independence of Ukraine. Thus, the two former adversaries agreed to join forces to fight against the Bolshevik threats. The Ukrainians were exiled, however, as the Soviets had retaken their lands in the brief Soviet-Ukrainian theater of the Russian Civil War. This newfound alliance with Petliura gave Marshal Pilsudski of Poland around 15,000 to 35,000 Ukrainian expeditionary troops. the stage seemed set for a joint offensive to force a favorable peace against the Bolsheviks. However, by early 1920, the Soviet forces had won a series of major victories against the White Russian forces. In the Crimea, the White Russian forces under Anton Denikin had been outflanked and wiped out by Red Army units commanded by a certain Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Tukhachevsky had served as an officer in the Russian Empire in World War I and had been imprisoned in Germany, at one point sharing a cell with the future French World War II leader Charles de Gaulle. Escaping from captivity, Tukhachevsky had joined the Red Army under Leon Trotsky and Premier Lenin, quickly rising through the ranks. During the Russian Civil War, Tukhachevsky led the Fifth Army to conquer Siberia and the defeat of the White Russian leader Admiral Alexander Kolchak. Tukhachevsky's tactics of using concentrated attacks to exploit weak spots in the enemy flanks and envelop them during the Russian Civil War had won him fame, and even the Western media referred to him as the Red Napoleon. Leon Trotsky, the supreme commander of the Red Army, placed Tukhachevsky in command of the Western Front against Poland now that the White Russians had been pretty much defeated. The Polish front had, in the eyes of many Bolshevik senior commanders, been merely a minor distraction. However, now that the Russian Civil War was being concluded, Lenin and Trotsky turned their attention westward for world revolution. In January 1920, the Red Army began to deploy 700,000 men near the Berezina River in the Belarusian Socialist Republic. Eventually, that number reached around 800,000. The army was split in half, with one half being at the aforementioned Western Front, while the other half at the Southwestern Front in Galicia. The Red Army had a lot of military equipment at their disposal left by the Germans after World War I, modern Allied armaments such as armored cars, trains, trucks, and artillery, as well as equipment captured from the White Russians and their allies. While Tukhachevsky commanded the Western Front, the Southwestern Front was under the command of Alexander Yegorov, a Bolshevik general who had pushed the White Russians out of southern Russia. Under Yegorov was a young general named Joseph Stalin, whom had previously helped Lenin rise to power through his use of violent intimidation tactics. Stalin had risen to prominence in the Soviet command after his successful defense of the city of Tsaritsyn during the Russian Civil War. Other Soviet commanders included the famed cavalryman Semyon Bedony, Stalin's close friend Klement Voroshilov, and Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder and head of the feared Cheka secret police force. Now, the Red Army under Trotsky looked west and planned their next offensive. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Polish-Soviet War, and we will catch you on the next one.